Hey guys. The city is quiet now. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. More like the tired kind. The kind that happens when everything loud has already happened. The fires are still there, but they're smaller. They crackle instead of roar. A few rooftops glow red, like they forgot to stop burning. Smoke drifts slowly, not in a hurry anymore. It has nowhere to be. Dust hangs in the air. It settles on stones, broken doors, abandoned carts. It settles on everything that didn't get the chance to run. Somewhere in the distance, a horse snorts. Metal creaks. A soldier laughs, then stops, like he remembers this is not the place for laughing. This is what victory looks like after everyone stops shouting. History books love the shouting part. The charge. The banners. The moment the enemy line breaks. They really enjoy that part. But bedtime stories work better in the quiet. So tonight, we stay here. In the hours after the triumph. When the swords are cleaned. When the numbers are counted. When the winners finally have time to breathe. This is the moment people don't usually talk about. Because victory sounds clean when you say it fast. But when you say it slowly, it gets complicated. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the name Genghis Khan is already spreading. Carried by messengers. Whispered by survivors. Written later by historians who were not here tonight. They will say he conquered. They will say he united tribes. They will say he changed the world. All true. And also incomplete. Because conquest does not end when the gates fall. It begins a different phase. The phase where ordinary lives meet extraordinary power. Inside the city, doors hang open. Some were kicked in. Some were left that way when people fled and never came back. A cooking pot still sits over cold coals. Someone meant to return to it. In a small courtyard, a dog waits. It does not understand banners or empires. It only knows its people are late. Victory does not knock before entering a home. It just arrives. And when it does, it makes decisions very quickly. Who lives? Who dies? Who is taken? Who is left behind? These decisions are rarely written down in detail. Especially when it comes to women. In heroic conquest stories, women are background objects. They appear briefly. A princess here. A marriage there. A line about spoils that everyone pretends not to notice. Then the story moves on. But women were not side notes in conquered cities. They were there in the smoke. In the silence. In the long night after victory. They were listening too. Listening to boots outside. To unfamiliar languages. To the sound of their old world ending, not with a bang, but with paperwork, orders, and tired soldiers doing what they had been told was normal. This is the part that makes history uncomfortable. So it often gets skipped. Because it's easier to admire a conqueror from far away. Harder to sit in the aftermath. The Mongol war machine was efficient. That word comes up a lot. Efficient sounds neat. Like a well-organized toolbox. But efficiency in war means fewer pauses. Less hesitation. More follow-through. Terror was not a side effect. It was a feature. Cities that resisted were meant to be examples. Examples are never gentle. By the time the night falls, everyone knows the rules now. Resist, and this happens. Submit, and maybe something slightly less terrible happens. Maybe. Victory sends a message long after the fighting stops. And the message travels fastest through fear. Women understood this immediately. They always do. Because they are often the ones who pay for messages written by men. Some hid. In cellars. Behind walls. under the bodies of the dead. Some stayed very still and hoped stillness would make them invisible. Some had already lost everything before the gates even fell. The thing about conquest is that it does not care who you are. It does not care if you baked bread yesterday. If you sang to your child. If you were planning a wedding. Victory does not check your schedule. Later historians would count populations. They would estimate losses. They would debate numbers. But numbers do not tell you how long a night feels when you don't know what comes next. This chapter is not about graphic horror. There will be no shouting here. No battlefield heroics. This is about the quiet dread that settles in when survival becomes your full-time job. It's about how conquest rearranges life without asking permission. The Mongol Empire would become one of the largest the world has ever seen. That is impressive. It really is. But empires are built out of moments like this one. Small. Silent. Personal. A woman sitting in a dark room, holding her breath, while victory decides her future without learning her name. History often praises speed. How fast armies moved. How quickly cities fell. But suffering moves slowly. It lingers. It stretches out into long nights and uncertain mornings. And it rarely gets a chapter of its own. That's why this story starts here. Not with a battle cry. Not with a map. But with a city trying to fall asleep while its world has just been reordered. Somewhere, soldiers are already dividing rewards. Gold. Horses. Objects. And people. This is not unique to the Mongols. That matters. But it does not make it softer. In this moment, victory feels heavy. Like a blanket that presses instead of comforts. The stars above the city look the same as they did before the siege. Stars are very bad at reacting appropriately to human tragedy. They shine anyway. And that might be the cruelest part. The world keeps going. Even when your life has just split into a before and an after. As the fires dim and the city grows quieter, something else becomes clear. The battle is over. But the consequences are just beginning. And most of them will not be sung about. So let's stay here a little longer. In the calm. In the aftermath. In the part of history that whispers instead of shouts. Because if we listen carefully, the silence tells us a lot. History usually enters the room with confidence. It clears its throat. It rolls out a map. It points at arrows. Big arrows. Fast arrows. Very serious arrows. And then it starts talking about generals. The camera zooms in on faces carved in stone. Men with strong jaws. Men with armor. Men who look like they have never done laundry in their lives. This is the usual vibe. Popular history loves tactics. Flanking maneuvers. Supply lines. Who tricked who? Who surprised who at dawn? It's like a board game recap. Only with more horses. And if a name comes up again and again, it's usually the same kind of name. A ruler. A commander. A conqueror. Someone like Genghis Khan. History really likes him. Not in a warm way. More in a, wow, look at the scale, way. How many cities? How many miles? How fast the empire grew. Bigger. Faster. More impressive. This is the language of great men and great empires. Great as in large. Great as in powerful. Great as in easy to put on a timeline. It's a language that sounds clean. Almost polished. And when you speak it long enough, you start to forget that empires are made of people. Regular people. Messy people. People who don't come with dramatic music. Especially women. In most conquest stories, women appear briefly. Like background props that wandered into the shot by accident. They show up as queens. Or wives. Or daughters used to seal alliances. Sometimes they are listed as numbers. Sometimes they are mentioned as spoils, which is a word that somehow manages to sound both fancy and horrifying at the same time. And then they disappear. History turns the page. Because generals are easier to track than lives. Tactics are easier to explain than trauma. Maps don't cry. When women do appear in these stories, they're often unnamed. No voice. No inner life. Just a role. The chroniclers didn't ask them questions. They didn't record what they felt. They didn't sit with them in the quiet after victory. Most of the people writing history were men. Educated men. Men close to power. They cared about decisions made in tents. Not decisions forced in bedrooms. And so the record leans a certain way. Not always out of cruelty. Often out of habit. It's hard to write about what you don't see as important. And for a long time, women's suffering was treated like background noise. Unfortunate, yes. But not central. Like weather. You might mention it briefly. Then move on. This is how entire experiences vanish. Not because they didn't matter. But because they didn't fit the story historians wanted to tell. A story about dominance. About strategy. About achievement. A story where victory is the ending, not the beginning of consequences. But here's the thing. Victory is never the end. It's just the moment the camera usually cuts away. After the banners are raised and the speeches are done, something else starts. Life under occupation. Life after loss. Life rearranged by someone else's success. Women were there for all of that. They were there when homes were reassigned. When families were broken apart. When survival required learning new rules very quickly. But their experiences don't come with clean bullet points. They don't fit nicely into a chapter called Results. So history often leaves them unnamed. Sometimes literally. We know how many cities fell. But not how many lives changed shape inside them. We know which battles were decisive. But not which nights were sleepless. And that's not an accident. Big stories prefer big movements. Small suffering is inconvenient. It slows things down. It asks uncomfortable questions. Like, who pays for greatness? And who gets remembered? There's also another reason women's experiences fade from conquest narratives. They were expected. In medieval warfare, violence against women was not considered shocking. It was considered normal. That doesn't mean it was accepted by those who suffered it. It means it didn't surprise the people in power. And when something is seen as normal, it rarely gets documented with care. No one pauses to describe the obvious. They just move on. So when we read history today, we inherit those silences. We read what was written. And we rarely notice what wasn't. Unless we slow down. Unless we listen to the gaps. This documentary is not here to rewrite history with modern outrage. That would be too easy. It's here to sit quietly in the places where the record goes thin. To notice who disappears when the story gets exciting. To ask why victory sounds so clean on paper, and so heavy in real life. The Great Men story has momentum. It moves fast. It doesn't stop to rest. But bedtime stories can afford to slow down. They can afford to whisper instead of shout. They can afford to say, let's look at what happened after the applause. Because when you do that, another version of history appears. Not a heroic one. A human one. One where women are not symbols or numbers, but people trying to adapt inside someone else's triumph. One where victory doesn't shine. It casts a long shadow. So as we move forward, the focus shifts. Away from generals and arrows. Away from maps and milestones. And toward the quieter side of conquest. The part that didn't make it into the speeches. The part that didn't get statues. The part that waited until the noise stopped. That's where this story lives now. Not because it's louder. But because it was ignored for too long. And in the silence, there's a lot to hear. To understand what came next, we need to understand the system. Not the battles. Not the legends. The system. Because the Mongol war machine didn't run on chaos. It ran on structure. Very serious structure. The kind that does not ask how you feel about things. At the center of it all was the army. Clean lines. Clear ranks. Simple rules. Units were organized in tens, hundreds, thousands. If you could count to 10, congratulations, you were already halfway to understanding Mongol military math. Everyone knew who they answered to. And what happened if they didn't? This wasn't a loose group of warriors charging wherever they felt like. This was a disciplined force that moved like a single body. Fast. Quiet. On purpose. Orders came down. They were followed. Not debated. Not adjusted. Obedience was not optional. It was survival. And that discipline didn't stop at the battlefield. It shaped how victory was handled too. When a city fell, there was already a plan. Not a nice plan. But a clear one. The Mongol leadership understood something very early. Fear travels faster than armies. So they used it. Terror was not random. It was strategic. Cities that resisted were punished harshly. Not because someone lost their temper. But because someone wanted the next city to hear about it. And they always did. Stories moved ahead of the army. Whispers. Rumors. Carefully exaggerated details. Sometimes not exaggerated at all. The message was simple. Submit early, and maybe you survive. Resist, and you become an example. Fear saved time. Fear saved resources. Fear reduced the need for long sieges. From a military point of view, it was efficient. From a human point of view, it was devastating. And here's where civilians enter the logic of war. In many medieval conflicts, civilians were technically not the target. In practice, that line was very thin. In the Mongol system, civilians became part of the calculation. Their suffering was not accidental. It was informational. Every destroyed home was a signal. Every displaced family was a warning. And women were right in the middle of this system. Not because the system cared about them. But because it didn't. When fear is your main tool, you don't limit where it lands. Civilian populations were absorbed into the outcome of conquest. They were counted. Moved. Redistributed. Sometimes spared. Sometimes not. It depended on the message being sent. The system rewarded obedience. It punished resistance. That sounds clean when you say it calmly. Which is exactly why it worked. Mongol armies were also highly mobile. They did not stay long. They moved on quickly. That meant decisions had to be made fast. Who gets taken? Who gets left? Who is useful? There wasn't time for reflection. In this system, people became categories. Skilled artisans might be spared for labor. Young men might be recruited or removed. Women might be assigned, relocated, or absorbed into households. This wasn't chaos. It was administration. Cold, efficient administration. And once a system like that is in place, individual suffering becomes background noise. No single soldier had to feel responsible. They were just following orders. And the orders were very clear. This is one of the most dangerous features of any organized violence. Responsibility gets spread so thin that it almost disappears. The Mongol war system also relied on loyalty. Absolute loyalty. Soldiers were bound to their units. Units were bound to their commanders. Commanders were bound to the leader. And at the top sat Mongol Empire, with authority flowing downward like gravity. You didn't argue with gravity. You adapted to it. Discipline was enforced strictly. Desertion was punished. Disobedience was punished. Sometimes collectively. That meant everyone watched everyone else. Fear didn't just point outward. It pointed inward too. And when fear is everywhere, empathy has very little room to breathe. This matters because systems shape behavior. A soldier raised in this structure learned very quickly what was normal. Looting was normal. Taking captives was normal. Redistributing people was normal. Questioning the system was not. So when women were taken after victory, it wasn't seen as an exception. It was seen as procedure. That does not make it less brutal. It explains how it could happen so consistently. The system did not pause to ask who someone was before the conquest. It only cared about who they were now. Conquered. And once someone is conquered, the system decides their role. That's how civilian life became part of warfare logic. Not by accident. But by design. Fear softened resistance before the army arrived. Fear continued working long after the army moved on. Even cities that surrendered peacefully were reshaped. Because submission did not mean safety. It meant survival under new rules. Rules written by people who did not live there. This is why conquest feels so total. It doesn't just change who rules. It changes how life functions. And women, again, felt this immediately. They were not fighting. But they were not outside the system either. They were inside it. Affected by it. Moved by it. Their lives reorganized by a military structure that never planned to learn their names. The Mongol war system was effective. History agrees on that. But effectiveness has a cost. And that cost is rarely paid by the people who design the system. It is paid by those who wake up the next morning in a city that no longer belongs to them. So as we move forward, keep this structure in mind. Not as an excuse. Not as a justification. But as the framework that made everything else possible. Because the brutal actions that followed victory didn't come from nowhere. They came from a system that knew exactly what it was doing. And did it very well. There is a phrase that shows up again and again in old records. Spoils of war. It sounds tidy. Almost festive. Like a prize table at the end of a very violent game. But spoils were not just gold. Not just horses. Not just silk or silver cups. Spoils were people. And women were a major part of that category. This was not unique to one army or one empire. Across the medieval world, conquest followed similar patterns. Rome did it. Persia did it. China did it. European kingdoms did it. The Mongols did it too. That matters for context. But context does not make it gentle. After a city fell, ownership shifted. Land. Buildings. Objects. And women. The idea was simple and deeply unsettling. If you conquer a place, everything in it now belongs to you. That included human beings. Women were treated as movable property. Transferable assets. Something that could be given, taken, traded, or rewarded. There was no paperwork explaining this. It didn't need explaining. Everyone already understood the rule. Captivity became a kind of currency. A soldier who fought well might receive a woman as part of his reward. A commander might receive several. Elites received the most. This was seen as normal. Expected. A perk of success. If that sounds cold, that's because it was. No one asked what the woman wanted. The system wasn't built for that question. She was no longer a person with a past. She was a result. The language used in sources is revealing. Women are taken, assigned, distributed. Very tidy verbs. Very quiet verbs. They hide what's actually happening. Once the conquest was complete, the redistribution began. Some women stayed near their original homes, absorbed into new households. Others were sent far away. Very far. Across steppe. Across borders. Across languages. Distance made resistance harder. Distance erased connections. If you wanted to break someone's old life completely, distance did most of the work for you. This redistribution followed rank. Ordinary soldiers received captives as laborers or concubines. Higher-ranking men received women considered more valuable. Value here did not mean humanity. It meant status. Youth. Beauty. Skill. The criteria were practical, not moral. And once assigned, a woman's future narrowed quickly. Her survival depended on her new owner's mood. His household rules. His favor. This was not romance. This was control. Concubinage was common across many empires, including the Mongol world. Women absorbed into these systems lived under constant uncertainty. They could be kept. They could be traded again. They could be discarded. Their bodies were not their own. Their time was not their own. And history rarely stops to explain this in detail. It often moves on quickly, as if embarrassed. Because to linger here would complicate the image of conquest. It would remind us that victory came with human costs that don't fit heroic language. For the Mongol elite, including households connected to Genghis Khan, women taken from conquered land strengthened power networks. They produced children. They extended influence. They became part of dynasty building. From above, this looked strategic. From below, it felt like erasure. A woman taken as spoils lost more than freedom. She lost her place in the world. Her name might change. Her language might disappear from daily life. Her old customs might be forbidden or mocked. She was expected to adapt quickly. Or suffer. And adaptation did not mean acceptance. It meant endurance. The system did not care whether a woman was married. Whether she had children already. Whether she had a life she loved. Those details did not survive conquest. The new order had no interest in them. There is something especially quiet about this kind of violence. No battlefield noise. No dramatic moment. Just a decision made by someone else. A finger pointing. A name called. A direction given. And suddenly, your life belongs to a stranger. This is why women's suffering after conquest often feels invisible in records. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. In households. Behind walls. It became routine. Routine does not get written down often. Chroniclers focused on what impressed them. Battles won. Territory gained. Not the daily reality of captives waking up in unfamiliar rooms. And because this practice was widespread across empires, it was rarely questioned. When everyone does something, it stops being news. It becomes background. That doesn't mean women experienced it as background. For them, it was everything. Every meal. Every command. Every night. Their lives became small and tightly controlled. And yet, many survived. Not because the system was kind, but because humans are stubborn. They learned new rules, new languages, new ways to avoid punishment. Survival became a skill. But survival under ownership is not freedom. It's endurance. And endurance rarely gets a statue. This chapter is uncomfortable because it strips away fantasy. It shows conquest not as glory, but as reorganization. Who belongs to whom? Who decides? Who obeys? Women as spoils of war were not symbols. They were not metaphors. They were people caught in a system that rewarded violence and obedience. A system that saw their bodies as benefits. As the empire expanded, this practice scaled up. More cities. More captives. More quiet suffering folded into success. This is not about judging the past by modern rules. It's about refusing to look away. Because if we only talk about victories and maps, we miss the cost. And the cost was paid in lives lived without choice. So when we hear about triumph, about conquest, about greatness, it helps to remember this layer. The one that doesn't shout. The one that waits patiently beneath the headlines. Women did not vanish after conquest. They were absorbed. And that absorption reshaped them forever. In the next chapter, we'll slow down even more. We'll look at what it meant to be taken away from everything familiar. Not as a number. Not as a reward. But as a person trying to survive the long aftermath of someone else's victory. Conquest doesn't always end with a door closing. Sometimes it ends with a road. A very long road. After the fighting stopped, after the lists were made, after people were counted and reassigned, many women were told to move. Not tomorrow. Not gently. Now. They were taken far from their regions. Far from rivers they knew. From streets they could walk with their eyes closed. Distance was part of the punishment. And part of the control. Some women were moved a few days away. Others were moved so far that the sky itself looked unfamiliar. Different winds. Different smells. Different stars. They were transported across vast distances, often on foot, sometimes on carts, sometimes on horseback if someone decided they were valuable enough. There were no explanations. No maps. No, you are here, signs. Just movement. The Mongol world was big. Really big. It stretched across land most people never imagined crossing in one lifetime. And suddenly, women who had never left their home region were moving through it without choice. The road didn't care if you were tired. Or scared. Or grieving. It kept going. Along the way, everything familiar peeled away. Family first. Mothers separated from daughters. Sisters pulled in different directions. Children left behind because they slowed the group. There was no dramatic farewell scene. No last hug with swelling music. Just a moment of realization. Oh. This is goodbye. Culture went next. Clothing marked you as different. Food tasted wrong. Customs that once felt normal suddenly felt dangerous. What used to be polite could now be a mistake. What used to be silence could now be seen as disrespect. No one handed out a rulebook. You learned by watching. Or by being punished. Language was one of the hardest barriers. Words you knew your whole life suddenly meant nothing. Orders were shouted in sounds that felt sharp and rushed. You learned quickly which tones meant trouble. Tone became more important than meaning. You nodded a lot. You kept your head down. You hoped guessing right was enough. This kind of displacement doesn't just move your body. It moves your identity. When no one understands your words, your thoughts start to feel quieter too. When no one knows your name, you stop hearing it. Women taken far from their regions lost the small things first. Songs. Jokes. Inside references that only made sense at home. Those things don't survive long journeys. Loneliness settled in quietly. Not the dramatic loneliness you see in movies. The slow one. The kind that shows up at night, when the camp is quiet and people talk in languages you don't know. You become very aware of your breathing. Of how far away everything is. Captivity is loud at first. Then it becomes very quiet. Some women traveled in groups. Others were isolated early. Isolation made control easier. If you don't share a language with anyone around you, resistance becomes almost impossible. Even comfort becomes rare. You can't explain what hurts. You can't explain what you need. You just endure. This was not accidental. Moving people far from their regions reduced the chance of escape. Reduced the chance of rebellion. Reduced the chance of being seen as human by those who took them. Strangers are easier to control. And in the system that followed the conquests of Genghis Khan, displacement was a tool. Not a side effect. Women absorbed into new households were expected to adapt quickly. New rules. New expectations. New dangers. And the past was not something you were encouraged to remember. Homesickness was not useful. Grief was not productive. You learned to pack those feelings away. Some women tried to hold on quietly. They whispered old songs under their breath. They repeated prayers silently. They taught children words from a language no one else spoke. These were small acts. But small acts mattered. Others chose a different kind of survival. They learned the new language fast. They copied customs. They tried to blend in. Not because they forgot who they were. Because blending in hurt less. Neither choice was easy. Both came with loss. The loneliness of captivity was not just physical. It was social. You were surrounded by people, but none of them were yours. You belonged to someone, but no one belonged to you. Time stretched. Days were marked by tasks, not meaning. And because these experiences happened behind walls and far from battlefields, history barely noticed. No chronicler followed these roads. No scribe recorded the quiet moments. They wrote about expansion. About order. Not about a woman staring at unfamiliar hills, wondering if anyone back home was still alive. Forced displacement breaks something deep. It teaches you that your life can be moved like an object. That roots are temporary. That safety is conditional. And once you learn that, it stays with you. Even if you survive. Especially if you survive. Some women never saw their homeland again. Others did, years later, so changed that it barely recognized them. And they barely recognized it. Displacement doesn't end when movement stops. It echoes. It reshapes how you trust. How you attach. How you imagine the future. This is why forced movement was such a powerful tool. It didn't just remove people from places. It removed places from people. As the empire grew, roads filled with stories that were never written down. Stories of long walks. Of confusion. Of silence. Victory looks fast on a map. But for those being moved, it felt endless. So when we talk about conquest, it helps to remember this. That sometimes the most important part of the story is not where the army went, but where the captives were forced to follow. In the next chapter, we'll step inside the households where many of these journeys ended. Not as a relief, but as another form of control. For now, let the road stretch out behind us. Quiet. Unmarked. Full of lives that were carried away from everything familiar. And kept going anyway. When the road finally ended, it didn't end in freedom. It ended in a household. Sometimes a tent. Sometimes a compound. Sometimes a place that looked calm from the outside. Inside, everything had rules. This is where concubinage comes in. Not romance. Not choice. A system. Among the Mongol elite, concubinage was normal. Structured. Organized. Powerful men collected women the way they collected alliances. Each woman added something. Status. Connections. Children. Women absorbed into these households were expected to fit in quickly. Very quickly. You learned where to stand. When to speak. When not to. You learned who had authority over you. And who had authority over them. Households ran on hierarchy. At the top sat the man. Below him, his primary wife or wives. Below them, concubines. Each layer watched the one below it. This meant women lived under constant surveillance. Not guards with spears. Worse. Other people. Eyes everywhere. Whispers. Rules enforced through looks and tone. Privacy was rare. Trust was rarer. Loss of autonomy didn't arrive all at once. It came in small pieces. You could no longer decide where you slept. Or when you ate. Or who touched you. Your body followed someone else's schedule. That does something to a person. Concubinage was presented as stability. You were fed. You were housed. You were protected. On paper, it looked organized. In reality, it meant your safety depended on favor. Favor is not stable. Favor changes with mood. With politics. With jealousy. A woman's position in the household could rise or fall overnight. A single comment. A single rumor. A single child born to someone else. And yes, children mattered. A lot. Children born into captivity became part of the power structure. A son could raise a woman's status. A daughter might not. Lineage shaped everything. Who your child's father was mattered more than who you were. This is where power really shows itself. Women's futures were often decided by their wombs. That sounds harsh. Because it was. If a woman bore a child connected to powerful lineage, her life might stabilize. Not become free. But safer. If she did not, her position stayed fragile. She could be traded again. Reassigned. Forgotten. Children born into these systems grew up inside conquest. They learned early who mattered. Where they stood. Some would rise high. Some would vanish into records as footnotes. Their mothers stayed in between. Necessary. But never fully secure. For elite households tied to figures like Genghis Khan, concubinage was political. Women from conquered regions extended influence. They symbolized dominance. They also connected families across cultures. From the outside, this could look like integration. From the inside, it felt like control wearing a polite mask. Daily life was carefully managed. Tasks. Schedules. Expectations. A woman's movements were noticed. Her tone was noticed. Her reactions were noticed. You learned to be very good at reading the room. That skill kept you alive. Surveillance wasn't always loud. It was quiet. Someone always knew where you were. Someone always reported something. And because the system depended on order, disorder was punished. Sometimes directly. Sometimes indirectly. Isolation. Reduction of rations. Loss of status. Punishment didn't need violence to be effective. Fear handled most of it. Women adapted in different ways. Some stayed invisible. They spoke little. They avoided attention. Others tried to become indispensable. Managing households. Raising children well. Navigating relationships carefully. Neither path guaranteed safety. But both were strategies. Concubinage also erased the past. A woman's previous life was irrelevant. Her old family ties were gone. Her old name might be replaced. What mattered now was her role. This erasure made resistance difficult. You cannot argue from a position that no longer exists. And yet, identity doesn't vanish completely. It hides. Women remembered who they were quietly. In habits. In stories told to children when no one else listened. Small acts of memory became acts of survival. The system didn't care about that. As long as order was maintained, inner lives didn't matter. This is why concubinage was so effective as a tool of control. It looked stable. It looked organized. It kept women close and contained. It turned human relationships into assets. And because it was normalized, it rarely raised alarms. Chroniclers wrote about marriages. About heirs. About succession. They did not write about women counting footsteps in the hallway. They did not write about sleeping lightly, listening for changes in tone. Those details didn't seem important to empire building. But they mattered. They shaped how women lived every day. They shaped how children learned what power looked like. Concubinage taught a clear lesson. You exist at someone else's permission. And permission can be withdrawn. This is not chaos. It is order. A very specific kind of order. One that keeps power stable by making others uncertain. So when we talk about households after conquest, it's important to drop the fantasy. This was not domestic peace. It was controlled space. A quieter battlefield. With different rules. Women survived it by being observant. By being careful. By being adaptable. Not because they were weak. Because they had no choice. As we move forward, remember this structure. Remember how control didn't always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrived with routines. With expectations. With a roof and a role. In the next chapter, we'll look at how violence didn't end at the household door. How it followed women even into these controlled spaces. For now, let the house settle around us. Quiet. Ordered. And heavy with rules that were never written down. This chapter needs a different voice. Still calm. Still steady. But careful. Because some things don't need details to be understood. They just need honesty. Sexual violence has always followed war. Not as an accident. As a tool. That's uncomfortable to say out loud. Which is probably why history often mumbles it and moves on. In the world of conquest, violence was not only about winning battles. It was about sending messages. And sexual violence was one of the messages people understood the fastest. Not because it was loud. Because it was personal. In the campaigns connected to Genghis Khan, error was used on purpose. We've already talked about that. Cities were meant to hear what happened to other cities. Communities were meant to imagine their own future and decide to surrender early. This is where sexual violence fits into the system. Not as chaos. As intimidation. It targeted families, not armies. Honor, not defenses. When a community heard that its women were not safe, resistance weakened. Not because people were cowards. Because they were human. War planners understood this very well. You don't need to destroy every wall if you can destroy morale. Sexual violence worked quietly and efficiently. It broke trust inside families. It broke the idea that surrender guaranteed safety. It made fear permanent. And that permanence mattered. A burned building can be rebuilt. Trauma lives longer. This violence was also about humiliation. Not just of individuals. Of entire populations. It told defeated people, we control even the most private parts of your life. That message didn't need repetition. Once was enough. And here's where history gets very quiet. Chroniclers rarely described these acts directly. Not because they didn't happen. But because they were considered shameful. Shame has a strange habit of being placed on victims instead of perpetrators. So records use vague language. Taken. Dishonored. Abused. Words that blur instead of explain. Words that let readers look away. There are no long descriptions. No names. No voices. Just silence. That silence is not proof of absence. It is proof of discomfort. Most historians writing at the time were men. Men writing for other men. Men concerned with reputation, lineage, power. They did not want to dwell on things that complicated victory. So they didn't. And women paid for that silence twice. First in the act itself. Then in being erased from the record. Women's own voices are almost entirely missing. We don't have diaries. We don't have testimonies. We have outcomes. We have patterns. We have demographic shifts that tell us something happened, even when no one wrote it down. Absence becomes evidence. This kind of violence also worked because it blended into existing norms. In medieval societies, women's bodies were already controlled by families and customs. War intensified that control and handed it to conquerors. So when sexual violence occurred, it didn't always register as a separate crime. It registered as conquest continuing by other means. That normalization made it harder to name. Harder to resist. Harder to record. And because it was indirect, because it happened in homes and tents instead of fields, it avoided the spotlight. Battles had witnesses. This did not. Which brings us to something important. Sexual violence as a weapon doesn't always look dramatic. It looks like fear changing behavior. Women hiding more. Families making impossible choices. Communities breaking apart quietly. It looks like silence at dinner. Like people not asking questions. It looks like survival strategies. And yes, there is a kind of dark irony here. History loves to talk about strength. About toughness. About who endured. But the endurance of women in these moments rarely gets praise. Because endurance doesn't look heroic. It looks tired. It looks quiet. And it doesn't fit into a story about greatness. So the record stays thin. We know sexual violence was used to break resistance. We know it spread fear faster than armies. We know it left long-term damage. What we don't know are the names. And that matters. Because without names, suffering becomes abstract. And abstraction makes it easier to move on. This documentary doesn't try to fill in those missing details with imagination. That would be disrespectful. Instead, it acknowledges the gap. It says, something happened here, and we don't get to see it clearly. That lack of clarity is part of the harm. Women carried this trauma in silence because silence was safer. Speaking could bring punishment. Or shame. Or disbelief. So they didn't speak. They survived. And survival is not the same as healing. Generations later, historians try to read between the lines. They look at sudden population changes. At marriage patterns. At laws tightening control over women afterward. These are echoes. Not voices. And they tell us that sexual violence was not a side note. It was integrated into how conquest worked. Not every soldier committed it. Not every encounter followed the same pattern. But the system allowed it. And that allowance is what matters. Because when a system allows something, it encourages it. Silence from leadership becomes permission. Silence from history becomes denial. This is one of the hardest chapters to sit with. Because it doesn't give us stories. It gives us absences. And absences are unsettling. They ask us to imagine without spectacle. To understand without details. To respect pain without turning it into content. So we keep this chapter quiet. We don't dramatize. We don't linger. We acknowledge, and we move forward. Not because it's easy. But because pretending it didn't happen would be easier, and wrong. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what came after. How women lived with the aftermath. How survival continued inside systems that never apologized. For now, let the silence remain what it is. Not empty. Heavy. And full of things history chose not to say out loud. There is something missing in the records. Not a detail. Not a footnote. Something larger. Names. When historians describe conquest, they count things. Cities. Battles. Deaths. Numbers behave nicely. They line up. They fit into tables. People do not. Especially women. In most records connected to the conquests tied to Genghis Khan, women appear as quantities. So many taken. So many redistributed. So many absorbed. No names. No ages. No voices. Just totals. And once someone becomes a number, it becomes very easy to forget that they were ever a person. Numbers don't argue. Numbers don't remember birthdays. Numbers don't miss home. They just sit there. Quiet. This is how anonymous suffering enters history. Not because no one suffered. But because no one wrote down who they were. Chroniclers were not interested in personal stories. They were interested in outcomes. Who gained power? Who lost land? Who inherited what? A woman taken after conquest rarely changed the outcome of a war. So she didn't matter to the story being told. That doesn't mean she didn't matter. It means the story had a filter. And that filter removed names. When women do appear in sources, they are often identified by relation. Someone's daughter. Someone's wife. Someone's concubine. Their identity is defined by proximity to a man. If the man disappears from the record, so do they. It's like watching people fade when the camera pans away. This creates a strange problem for historians. They know something happened. The patterns are clear. But the individuals are gone. So historians reconstruct. They look at population changes. At sudden increases in mixed heritage children. At household records that expand quickly. They compare accounts from different regions. They read between the lines. This is detective work. Careful. Slow. And deeply frustrating. Because you can see the shape of the suffering, but not the faces. It's like hearing footsteps without seeing who walked. Patterns tell us that women were taken. Moved. Controlled. But patterns don't tell us what it felt like to wake up in a place where no one knows your name. Or what it felt like when your name stopped being used at all. The erasure of names does something subtle. It makes violence feel distant. Abstract. It allows people centuries later to say things like, "That was just how it was back then." Which is true. And also incomplete. Because, how it was experienced by real people with real inner lives. People who laughed at specific jokes. Who preferred certain foods. Who had nicknames? None of that survives. And that loss is part of the harm. When suffering is anonymous, it's easier to ignore. No one asks what happened to someone they can't imagine. This is why naming matters. But history didn't care about naming these women. It cared about order. About lineage. About who ruled next. So the women who lived through conquest became invisible the moment they stopped being useful. Even when they bore children, the record focused on the child's future. Not the mother's past. She becomes a background condition. Necessary. But unnamed. There is also shame involved. Sexual violence, captivity, forced relationships. These were not things medieval writers wanted to dwell on. Especially when they happened to women from conquered populations. Writing it down risked dishonoring families. Or exposing cruelty. So silence became the default. And silence is very effective at erasing people. Over time, that silence hardens. It turns into gaps in the archive. And gaps turn into forgetfulness. Modern historians try to fill those gaps responsibly. They avoid guessing. They avoid dramatizing. They use phrases like likely and suggests. Cautious language. Because without names, certainty is hard. But emotional truth still exists. Even without names. We know what forced displacement does to people. We know what loss of autonomy feels like. We know what living under surveillance does to the mind. We don't need a diary to know that being forgotten hurts. Being unnamed adds another layer to suffering. It tells you that your experience was not worth remembering. That message echoes. Even centuries later. This is why documentaries like this slow down. Why they resist the urge to rush past. Because speed favors the powerful. Slowness creates space for the forgotten. It doesn't bring names back. But it acknowledges the loss of them. There's also something quietly tragic about anonymity. If you die in battle, history might remember you as a soldier. If you rule, history remembers your decisions. But if you survive conquest as a captive woman, history often remembers nothing at all. Survival without recognition. Pain without record. That's a heavy thing to carry. And yet, those women carried it. They lived. They adapted. They raised children. They made meaning in small spaces. None of that made it into the official story. So we're left with shadows. And shadows ask us to imagine responsibly. Not to invent scenes. But to accept that behind every number was a life as complex as ours. Someone who would have had opinions about the weather. Someone who got annoyed at small things. Someone who loved someone else. Those details matter. Even if we never learn them. The emotional cost of being forgotten is not just historical. It shapes how we understand the past. If we only remember conquerors, we learn the wrong lessons. We learn that power is all that matters. That suffering is secondary. That silence equals insignificance. This chapter exists to push back against that. To say, unnamed does not mean unimportant. It means overlooked. As we move forward, we'll talk more about survival. About how women lived within these systems despite being erased from records. For now, sit with the absence. With the empty spaces where names should be. They are not empty because nothing was there. They are empty because someone decided not to write them down. And that decision still shapes what we think history is. Quietly. Every time we turn the page. This chapter is about survival. Not the loud kind. Not the heroic movie kind. The quiet kind. The kind that happens every day, without applause. After conquest, after displacement, after being absorbed into households and systems built by others, many women did not simply vanish. They adapted. That word can sound cold. Like a manual. But adaptation here meant staying alive. And staying human. Some women learned new languages. Not because they wanted to. Because not understanding orders could get you punished. At first, it was basic things. Commands. Names. Tones. Later, more. Who to avoid. Who to trust a little. Which words were safe to say out loud. Language became armor. If you could speak, you could explain yourself. If you could explain yourself, you might avoid trouble. Fluency didn't mean belonging. It meant fewer misunderstandings. And fewer misunderstandings meant fewer consequences. Learning a new language also meant losing parts of the old one. Words you never used stopped coming easily. Expressions faded. That loss hurt. But survival required trade-offs. Women also learned to navigate new power structures. Fast. Who actually made decisions? Who only looked important? Who was dangerous on a good day? Who was dangerous on a bad day? Power rarely followed official titles. It followed moods. Relationships. Favor. Women became experts at reading rooms. A raised eyebrow. A pause too long. A sudden quiet. These details mattered more than rules written anywhere. Some women stayed invisible on purpose. They spoke little. They stayed out of conflicts. They made themselves useful but not noticeable. Invisibility was a shield. Others chose a different approach. They became necessary. Managing households. Organizing work. Caring for children well enough that people depended on them. Dependency could create protection. Not safety. Protection. There is a difference. Another survival strategy was forming quiet alliances. Not loud friendships. Not dramatic bonds. Small understandings. Sharing food. Sharing information. Warning each other when someone's mood shifted. Women noticed other women. They noticed who was new. Who was struggling. Who was isolated. A look across a room could say a lot. These alliances didn't overthrow systems. They softened them. They created small pockets where people looked out for each other. Sometimes that meant helping someone hide a mistake. Sometimes it meant helping someone recover after punishment. These acts were never written down. But they mattered. Children changed everything. For women who had children, survival strategies became more focused. Protecting children meant navigating danger very carefully. Teaching them when to speak. When not to. Which language to use with which person. Children learned early how to behave differently around different people. That is not childhood. That is training. Some women tried to shield children from fear. They told stories. They kept routines. Even small routines. A certain way of preparing food. A song hummed quietly. Normalcy became a form of resistance. Other women made hard choices. Aligning with power to secure safety for their children. Choices that outsiders might judge harshly. But survival rarely looks clean from the outside. Survival is practical. Women also learned when not to resist openly. Open resistance was dangerous. The system punished it quickly. So resistance became subtle. Remembering old customs in private. Passing down language quietly. Teaching children where they came from, even if they could never return. Memory became an act of defiance. Not loud. But persistent. Even in elite households connected to figures like Genghis Khan, women found ways to influence outcomes quietly. Through children. Through relationships. Through timing. Influence did not mean control. But it meant impact. Survival also meant emotional management. Women learned to compartmentalize. What you feel. What you show. Grief was dangerous if visible. Anger even more so. So emotions were folded inward. That doesn't mean women became numb. It means they learned when emotions were allowed. At night. In silence. Alone. This kind of inner discipline takes strength. The kind history rarely labels as strength. There is a strange myth that survival equals passivity. That if someone survives quietly, they must have accepted their situation. That is not how humans work. Endurance is not agreement. Endurance is strategy. Women who survived conquest did not do so by accident. They observed. They adapted. They made choices inside limited options. Those choices mattered. Some women protected other women. Some protected children who were not their own. Some helped newcomers understand rules faster. Don't stand there. Don't say that. Not now. These small warnings saved lives. This is what agency looks like when power is uneven. Not grand rebellion. But careful movement. Survival as resistance does not look dramatic. It looks like staying alive in a system that benefits from your disappearance. It looks like remembering who you are when the world tells you it doesn't matter. It looks like helping someone else survive too. History doesn't celebrate this kind of resistance. It doesn't fit into battle reports. But without it, far fewer people would have made it through. This chapter matters because it restores humanity. Not as victims only. But as actors. Limited actors. Constrained actors. But actors nonetheless. Women under conquest were not just carried along by events. They responded. They adjusted. They made meaning where they could. Survival is not a passive state. It is work. Daily work. Invisible work. And it deserves recognition. As we move forward, we'll look at the long-term consequences of these survival strategies. How children raised in conquest carried its imprint. How survival shaped generations. For now, let's sit with this truth. Even in systems designed to erase them, women found ways to persist. Quietly. Carefully. And sometimes, that quiet persistence was the strongest resistance available. Children change the story. They always do. After conquest, after displacement, after women were absorbed into households, something new appeared. Children of conquest. Mixed heritage children, born into a world that did not ask them who they wanted to be. These children carried two histories in one body. One side from the conquered. One side from the conquerors. On paper, that sounds like connection. In real life, it was confusing. Very confusing. Identity confusion started early. Which language do you speak at home? Which customs are yours? Which stories are safe to repeat? Children learned quickly that identity depended on context. Around some people, you leaned one way. Around others, you leaned another. This wasn't flexibility. It was survival. Many of these children were raised within conqueror society. They grew up learning the rules of the empire that absorbed them. They learned loyalty to power. They learned obedience. They learned which side of their history was praised. And which side was better kept quiet. For boys especially, lineage mattered. A child connected to a powerful father could rise fast. Names opened doors. Bloodlines created futures. This is where conquest became dynastic. Children of mixed heritage were used to strengthen families and alliances. Not emotionally. Politically. A son could tie regions together. A daughter could secure marriages. Children became bridges between conquered and conqueror. But bridges feel pressure from both sides. Emotionally, this was heavy. Imagine growing up knowing that one half of your existence came from violence. That your mother's presence in this household was not a choice. That your own place in the world depended on events you had nothing to do with. Children absorbed that tension quietly. They watched their mothers carefully. They learned which parts of her past were dangerous to mention. They noticed when she switched languages mid-sentence. When her voice changed tone depending on who entered the room. Children learn fast. Sometimes too fast. For mothers, children were both protection and vulnerability. A child could improve a woman's status. Especially if the child was male. But children also tied her permanently to the system. Leaving became impossible. Resistance became riskier. Everything revolved around keeping the child safe. And safety came with compromises. Children raised in elite households tied to figures like Genghis Khan lived lives that looked privileged from the outside. They had access to power, education, opportunity. But privilege doesn't erase confusion. It just gives it better clothing. These children often grew up with fractured identities. Too conqueror for the conquered. Too conquered for the conquerors. Belonging was conditional. They learned early how quickly favor could change. How quickly a family member could fall from grace. So emotional complexity became normal. Pride mixed with shame. Opportunity mixed with guilt. Some children leaned fully into the conqueror identity. It was safer. It offered clarity. Others clung quietly to their mother's culture. Songs whispered at night. Stories told softly. Those moments mattered. They anchored children to something older than empire. But even memory was dangerous. Too much attachment to the conquered side could mark you as unreliable. So children learned to balance. Balance is exhausting. And this balance didn't end with one generation. The consequences carried forward. Children of conquest grew up to raise children of their own. They passed down habits shaped by fear and adaptation. Silence became normal. Caution became inherited. Even generations later, families carried the imprint of conquest. You can see it in laws. In marriage patterns. In how power stayed concentrated. Empires don't just conquer land. They reshape families. From the outside, this looked like integration. Like diversity. Like success. From the inside, it felt like living in between. Not fully anything. There's also a quieter consequence. Children born into these systems normalize them. If conquest is all you've ever known, it feels natural. The violence that created your family becomes background. This is how systems perpetuate themselves. Not through force alone. Through upbringing. Through normalizing imbalance. That's one of the most lasting impacts of conquest. It doesn't just change borders. It changes what feels normal to the next generation. Some children of conquest rose to power. They became generals. Administrators. Leaders. History remembers them. Often without mentioning how their families began. Other children faded into ordinary life. Their mixed heritage became invisible over time. Names changed. Stories shortened. Eventually, even they might not know where they came from. That loss of origin is also a consequence. You can survive conquest and still lose your story. For women, watching children grow up inside this system was complicated. Pride mixed with grief. Seeing a child succeed meant seeing them move further from her past. Protection came at the cost of erasure. And yet, many women poured everything into those children. Because in a world that took so much, raising a child was one of the few things that still felt like creation. Not destruction. Children of conquest were not symbols. They were people navigating impossible inheritance. They didn't choose empire. Empire chose them. And they carried its weight quietly. This chapter matters because it reminds us that conquest does not end in one lifetime. It echoes. Through children. Through families. Through habits passed down without explanation. The emotional complexity doesn't fade quickly. It softens over time. It reshapes. But it doesn't disappear. As we move forward, we'll look at what daily life inside the empire looked like for women who survived. Not the dramatic moments. The ordinary ones. For now, let's sit with the children. Born into history they did not choose. Carrying past and future at the same time. Trying to belong in a world built by conquest. Quietly. Every day. Life inside the empire was not dramatic most of the time. That's the important part. It wasn't constant crisis. It wasn't constant violence. It was routine. And routine is where power settles in. Most women spent their days doing domestic labor. Cooking. Cleaning. Fetching water. Preparing clothing. Caring for children who were not always their own. These tasks filled the hours. Not because anyone cared about comfort. Because households had to function. Work created order. Order created control. Domestic labor was invisible work. If it was done well, no one noticed. If it was done poorly, everyone noticed. That imbalance kept people careful. Some women lived close to power. Court life existed for a small number of them. These women moved through tents and compounds where decisions were made. They saw visitors arrive. They heard fragments of conversations. Court life looked impressive from the outside. Better food. Finer clothing. Less physical labor. But it came with its own risks. Closer to power meant closer to danger. A wrong word overheard. A rumor repeated. A look misread. Favor could shift fast. Very fast. One day you were useful. The next day, you were a problem. Rural captivity looked different. Women placed in smaller households or distant settlements worked harder physically. Fields. Animals. Food production. Less politics. More exhaustion. But sometimes, slightly more space to breathe. Less attention meant fewer sudden reversals. That didn't mean safety. It meant a different kind of risk. In both court and countryside, uncertainty was constant. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. A new order. A new marriage arrangement. A transfer. The empire moved. People were expected to move with it. Even those who stayed in one place lived with the sense that nothing was permanent. That feeling changes how you live. You stop planning far ahead. You focus on getting through today. Then tomorrow. Shifting favor was the background noise of life. You learned to watch faces carefully. A smile that didn't reach the eyes. A greeting skipped. A task reassigned. These were signals. They told you whether you were safe today. Or less safe. Danger rarely announced itself. It crept in quietly. Through gossip. Through silence. Sometimes danger came from above. A powerful figure in a bad mood. A political shift. A loss of status. Sometimes it came sideways. Jealousy. Competition between women. Tension inside households. The system encouraged this. If everyone is slightly insecure, no one organizes. That's how control maintains itself. The quiet grind of survival filled the days. Wake up. Work. Observe. Adjust. Repeat. This rhythm dulled sharp emotions. There was no space for big reactions. Big reactions attracted attention. Attention brought risk. So emotions were flattened. Not erased. Flattened. Joy became small. Private. A child laughing. A successful meal. A moment alone. Grief also became quiet. There was no ceremony for loss. People disappeared. Life continued. The empire did not pause for mourning. Even in households connected to figures like Genghis Khan, daily life followed this rhythm. Decisions made at the top rippled downward. A new campaign meant more movement. A political marriage meant rearrangements. Women adjusted. Always adjusting. Some days were boring. That sounds strange, but boredom mattered. Boredom meant no immediate danger. No sudden changes. Just work and repetition. Boredom was a kind of relief. Other days were tense. A visitor arrived unexpectedly. A command was delivered without explanation. On those days, everyone moved carefully. Spoke less. Watched more. Life inside the empire was not one experience. It was many. But they shared this feeling of instability. Nothing was fully yours. Not your time. Not your future. You learned not to get attached. Attachment made loss sharper. This affected how relationships formed. Friendships stayed cautious. Trust grew slowly. People learned not to share everything. You never knew who might repeat it. And yet, people still connected. Because humans do that. Even under pressure. Women talked while working. Shared small complaints. Small jokes. Humor survived. Dry humor. Quiet humor. The kind that doesn't carry far. Laughing too loudly could be noticed. So laughter stayed soft. Children grew up inside this rhythm. They learned what was normal by watching adults. Work. Caution. Observation. They learned that rules could change without warning. That power was not predictable. That survival required flexibility. This is how systems teach. Not through lessons. Through daily life. The empire didn't need to threaten constantly. The structure did the work. People internalized the rules. They became careful on their own. That's the quiet grind. No chains visible. Just habits. For women, days blended together. Weeks passed without markers. Time was measured by tasks. By seasons. By the arrival and departure of people more powerful than you. This kind of life doesn't leave dramatic stories. It leaves endurance. Which is why it's easy to overlook. But endurance shapes history just as much as battles. Without women keeping households running, the empire wouldn't function. Food doesn't appear by itself. Children don't raise themselves. Order depends on labor. Unseen labor. And yet, recognition never followed. The grind continued whether anyone noticed or not. That's the rhythm we need to hear. Not the drumbeat of conquest. But the steady, repetitive sound of daily survival. As we move forward, we'll start stepping back. Looking at patterns across empires. Seeing how common these experiences were. For now, stay here. In the routine. In the ordinary. Because most of life inside the empire was not a moment you'd write about. It was a day you got through. Then another. And another. Quietly. Until survival itself became the story. At this point, a fair question shows up. A very human question. Was this just the Mongols? Short answer, no. Longer answer, also no, but with extra sighing. When we zoom out, the pattern gets wider. Very wide. Across the medieval world, conquest followed familiar habits. Different flags. Different gods. Same results. Empires rose, expanded, and celebrated victory. And women paid quiet costs along the way. Take the Roman world. When Rome conquered a city, people were taken. Women became captives. Households absorbed them. Roman writers didn't hide this. They just didn't linger. It was normal. The same logic appears in Islamic empires like the Abbasids. Concubinage. Slavery. Household control. Again, not chaos. Systems. Medieval European kingdoms followed similar paths. Raids. Forced marriages. Women treated as prizes and guarantees. Different language. Same idea. And in East Asia, dynasties expanded with similar outcomes. Captured women used to stabilize power. To produce heirs. To bind regions together. So when we talk about the Mongols, including those led by Genghis Khan, we are not pointing at a strange exception. We are pointing at a very common rule. That matters. Because sometimes comparison is used to soften judgment. People say things like, everyone did it back then. Which is true. And also not comforting. Because common does not mean painless. Widespread does not mean acceptable. Pain doesn't shrink just because it's shared. If anything, it spreads. Comparison helps us understand structure. Not excuse suffering. Across empires, women were treated as part of the reward system. Land. Gold. People. This logic normalized violence. Not as an outburst. As a process. Conquest culture trained people to expect it. To accept it. To stop asking questions. When violence is normalized, it becomes invisible. And invisible violence is very efficient. Empires didn't need to constantly enforce these rules with force. People learned them. They passed them on. That's how systems last. The universal pattern here is not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's utility. Women were useful. For labor. For reproduction. For alliance building. Usefulness replaced personhood. And that replacement shows up everywhere. In Rome. In the caliphates. In European kingdoms. In steppe empires. Different scripts. Same play. This doesn't reduce suffering. It explains why it was so hard to stop. If every empire around you treats women this way, it stops looking like a choice. It looks like the natural order. And natural orders are the hardest to challenge. Another shared feature across empires is silence. Chroniclers focused on rulers. On battles. On succession. Women appear briefly. Then fade. Not because they weren't there. Because they weren't considered central. That silence repeats across cultures. Different languages. Same gaps. And those gaps hide costs. Costs that never make it into victory speeches. When we compare empires, something else becomes clear. The suffering of women was not a side effect. It was built in. Conquest required disruption. Disruption required fear. Fear landed hardest on those with the least protection. Women. Children. The elderly. Every empire understood this, even if they didn't say it out loud. They planned around it. That's the uncomfortable part. This is not about good empires versus bad empires. It's about how conquest culture itself worked. It rewarded domination. It rewarded extraction. It treated people as resources. Women bore hidden costs because those costs were easy to hide. They happened in homes. In private spaces. Away from public squares and official records. That pattern is everywhere. And because it's everywhere, it often feels inevitable. But inevitability is a story people tell after the fact. At the time, it was a series of choices. Made by those in power. Repeated by systems. And absorbed by everyone else. Comparison also shows us something quieter. Women across empires developed similar survival strategies. Learning languages. Navigating households. Protecting children. Even when cultures were different, the responses were similar. That tells us something important. It tells us that the human response to control is adaptation. Not because people accept injustice. Because they want to live. So when we compare empires, we should do it carefully. Not to rank suffering. Not to decide who was worse. But to see the pattern clearly. And the pattern says this. Whenever conquest becomes a way of life, women pay costs that rarely get counted. They pay with autonomy. With safety. With memory. And history calls it normal. This chapter is not meant to spread blame evenly. It's meant to remove excuses. Saying, everyone did it, does not erase responsibility. It shows how deeply rooted the problem was. And how long it lasted. Empires fell. Borders shifted. But these patterns survived. They passed from one power to the next. That's the real legacy of conquest culture. Not just buildings and laws. But habits of thinking. Habits that made violence ordinary. Habits that taught people who mattered and who didn't. Women bearing hidden costs is not a Mongol story. It's a human one. A repeating one. And repetition doesn't make it less tragic. It makes it more urgent to notice. As we move forward, we'll step back from comparison and return to impact. How these systems shaped minds. How trauma settled into daily life. For now, let this comparison sit with us. Not as comfort. As clarity. Because once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee. And once you unsee nothing, you can't pretend this was rare. Or accidental. Or small. It was everywhere. Quietly. For a very long time. By this point in the story, something heavy has settled in. Not on the map. Not in the numbers. In the mind. This chapter is about that weight. The kind you carry quietly. Because after conquest, after displacement, after loss of control, the damage didn't stop. It moved inward. Trauma didn't come with a label. There wasn't a word for it. No neat term that explained why your chest felt tight for no clear reason. Why sudden noises made your body react before your thoughts did. Trauma without language is hard. You can't explain it. You can't point to it. You just feel wrong in ways you can't name. And if you can't name something, it's hard to ask for help. So most women didn't. They adjusted. Grief worked the same way. There were no ceremonies. No official mourning. No time set aside to say goodbye to the life you lost. The empire did not pause for grief. It had schedules. Grief became something you carried quietly, like an object hidden under clothing. Heavy. Always there. Never discussed. People disappeared. Family members vanished into roads, households, graves. There was no confirmation. No closure. Just absence. And absence is a very demanding thing. Fear slowly became routine. At first, fear is loud. Your heart races. Your thoughts jump. But over time, fear gets tired. It settles into habit. You learn what to avoid. When to speak. When to stay quiet. Fear stops feeling like panic and starts feeling like background noise. That's when it's most powerful. Because you stop questioning it. You build your life around it. Normal life continued around abnormal suffering. That's one of the strangest parts. Meals were cooked. Children played. Tasks were completed. On the outside, things looked ordinary. On the inside, everything was tense. People learned to smile while listening carefully. To laugh softly, just in case. Humor survived, but it changed. It became dry. Very dry. The kind of humor that doesn't ask for attention. Jokes whispered while working. Looks exchanged that said, "Well, this is happening." Humor wasn't about joy. It was about relief. For a moment. Pain became quiet. Not because it went away. Because it had nowhere to go. Women learned to endure. That word sounds passive. It isn't. Endurance is effort. It takes energy to keep going when your inner world feels unstable. To wake up. To work. To care for children. To pretend that today is just another day. The psychological weight showed up in small ways. Trouble sleeping. Sudden sadness without a clear reason. Moments when the past felt very close, even years later. But there was no space to talk about it. Talking required trust. Trust was rare. So pain became private. This kind of endurance doesn't look heroic. There are no speeches. No recognition. Just persistence. And persistence can be exhausting. Even in households connected to powerful figures like Genghis Khan, the psychological strain didn't disappear. Power didn't remove fear. It just changed its shape. Women closer to power worried about favor. Women further away worried about survival. Different fears. Same weight. Children grew up inside this atmosphere. They absorbed it. They learned what not to ask. They learned when adults went quiet for reasons they didn't understand. Fear became part of the environment. Like weather. You didn't discuss it. You dressed for it. This is how trauma passes forward. Not through stories. Through behavior. Through silence. The quiet endurance of pain also changed how people related to time. The future felt uncertain. Planning far ahead felt risky. So life shrank into manageable pieces. Today. This task. This moment. That focus helped people cope. But it also limited hope. Hope is dangerous when disappointment is constant. So hope became cautious. Small. Allowed only in safe moments. This psychological weight didn't mean people were broken. It means they were carrying something heavy for a very long time. And carrying something heavy changes how you move. How you think. How you see yourself. Some women blamed themselves. Not because they were responsible. Because that's what humans do when they lack explanations. If I had done something differently. That thought repeats. Even when it doesn't make sense. Shame often followed trauma. Not earned shame. Inherited shame. The kind placed on people by systems that refuse to admit harm. So women learned to keep their heads down. To avoid drawing attention. Visibility felt dangerous. Being noticed could mean trouble. So many women became experts at being present but unseen. This chapter doesn't end with healing. There were no therapists. No safe spaces. There was life. And life continued. That continuation is both sad and impressive. Sad because suffering was unaddressed. Impressive because people survived anyway. The psychological weight did not stop women from loving children, from forming bonds, from finding small meaning. Humans are stubborn like that. Pain didn't erase humanity. It shaped it. Quietly. Slowly. This is why conquest has such long shadows. The physical destruction fades. Buildings are rebuilt. But the psychological effects linger. In habits. In fears. In silences passed down. You don't need a record to see it. You see it in how people act. How careful they are. How they expect loss. This chapter matters because it reminds us that suffering is not only physical. It lives in the mind. And when the mind has no language for pain, pain becomes normal. That normalization is one of the most lasting effects of conquest. Not terror. Not violence. But the quiet acceptance of fear as part of life. As we move forward, we'll look at how memory works. How stories fade. How legends replace lives. For now, sit with this weight. Not to be overwhelmed by it, but to recognize it. Because recognizing quiet pain is the first step toward understanding the full cost of victory. And that cost didn't end when the fighting stopped. It followed people home. And stayed. Every day. In silence. Something strange happens over time. Lives fade. Stories harden. And then, somehow, legends show up and take the good seats. This is how conquerors become heroic legends. Not overnight. Slowly. Very slowly. At first, people talk about events. Battles. Marches. Victories. Then later, they talk about characters. Strong leaders. Brilliant tacticians. Unstoppable forces. And eventually, they talk about symbols. Names that stop feeling like people and start feeling like ideas. Someone like Genghis Khan. In popular history, he becomes scale. Speed. Impact. The man turns into a statistic with a personality. Legends work this way. They simplify. They smooth out rough edges. They keep what sounds impressive and quietly drop what makes things awkward. And suffering is very awkward. It slows the story down. It asks questions legends don't want to answer. So it gets edited out. Not with bad intentions most of the time. Just with priorities. When people tell stories about empire, they like clean lines. Growth. Expansion. Power. Suffering is messy. It doesn't fit into a highlight reel. So legends focus upward. On rulers. On victories. On maps growing larger. Lives lived underneath that growth become background noise. Or worse. They become footnotes. And footnotes are easy to skip. This is where romanticizing empire becomes dangerous. Because romance replaces reality. Empire starts to feel exciting. Adventurous. Impressive. You get phrases like world-shaping leader and history's greatest conqueror. Which might be true. But they don't tell you who paid for that greatness. Romantic stories don't mention women being moved like objects. They don't mention children growing up confused about who they are. They don't mention silence. Because silence doesn't sell. Legends are built to be repeatable. They need clear heroes. Clear momentum. Suffering complicates momentum. So it gets trimmed away like extra footage. Another thing legends do very well is distance. They push events far back in time. So far that they feel unreal. Once something feels unreal, empathy gets optional. It becomes easier to admire outcomes and ignore costs. This is why modern audiences rarely hear these stories. Not because the information doesn't exist, but because it doesn't fit the version of history people are used to consuming. Movies like Battles. Books like Rulers. Podcasts like Turning Points. Quiet endurance doesn't trend. There's also comfort in legend. Legends are easier to sit with before bed. They don't make you question too much. They don't make you wonder how many unnamed people were affected. They let you say, "That was a long time ago," and roll over. Lives don't do that. Lives linger. Lives make things personal. So over time, the story shifts. From "this happened" to "this mattered because it was big." And bigness becomes the measure of importance. That's a problem. Because big events are made of small lives. And when you remove the lives, you misunderstand the event. You start to think empire was just strategy and ambition. Not trauma and adaptation. Not fear and endurance. Legends also protect modern identities. People like to trace their history to power. It feels good to say, "My culture built something great." It feels less good to say, "That greatness came with suffering we don't talk about." So the legend stays shiny. The suffering stays invisible. This doesn't mean legends are lies. They are partial truths. And partial truths are very persuasive. They give you just enough information to feel informed, without making you uncomfortable. That's their strength. And their danger. Because when suffering is edited out, it becomes easier to repeat patterns. If empire looks glamorous, domination looks justified. If conquest looks necessary, resistance looks unreasonable. And suddenly, history stops being a warning and starts being inspiration. That's not great. This chapter exists to slow that process down. To gently pull the camera away from the statue and back toward the ground. Where people lived. And worried. And adapted. Modern audiences rarely hear these stories because they require patience. They don't have big reveals. They don't end with triumph. They end with continuation. And continuation doesn't feel dramatic. It feels real. There's also the issue of voice. Legends are usually told by the powerful or about the powerful. Women who lived under conquest rarely left records. So their stories don't come pre-packaged. They require reconstruction. Care. Willingness to sit with uncertainty. That's harder than repeating a legend. So most people don't. They stick with what's already polished. This is how lives get replaced. Not erased violently. Just slowly covered. Layer by layer. Until all you see is the legend. And once a legend is established, challenging it feels uncomfortable. People get defensive. They think you're attacking history. Or culture. Or identity. But telling fuller stories isn't about tearing anything down. It's about balance. It's about saying, yes, this empire mattered. And yes, people suffered. Both can be true. In fact, both must be true. Otherwise, we learn the wrong lesson. The danger of romanticizing empire is not that it praises the past. It's that it excuses harm. It teaches us to value outcomes over people. To admire power without questioning its cost. And when that happens, suffering becomes acceptable again. Just quieter. That's why these stories matter now. Not because they change what happened. But because they change how we understand it. They remind us that behind every legend is a long list of lives that didn't get statues. Lives that adapted instead of conquered. Lives that endured instead of expanded. Those lives don't glow. They don't dominate maps. But they are history. Even if they were edited out. So when you hear a legendary name, it's okay to admire scale. Just don't stop there. Ask who lived underneath it. Ask who adjusted their life around it. Ask who never got named. That doesn't ruin the story. It completes it. In the next chapter, we'll talk about records. About what they can't tell us. And why absence itself is a kind of evidence. For now, let the legend step aside for a moment. And make room for the lives it quietly replaced. They were always there. Waiting. For someone to notice. The city is quiet again. Not the heavy quiet from before. A different one. The kind that comes after exhaustion. Lamps dim one by one. Not all at once. No signal. Just people deciding they've had enough of today. A window closes somewhere. A door settles into its frame. A fire burns low and steady, like it's learned not to ask for attention. The conquered city rests. Streets that once held shouting now hold shadows. Dust has finally settled. It always does. Life didn't end here. It adjusted. People still wake up. Still work. Still cook. Still care for children. Loss does not stop routine. It reshapes it. Some homes are emptier. Some are fuller in unfamiliar ways. Some look the same from the outside and feel completely different inside. That's how conquest leaves its mark. Not always with ruins. Sometimes with rearrangement. A woman sits near a low flame, folding fabric the way she's done 100 times before. Her hands remember the motion even if her thoughts wander. A child sleeps nearby. Breathing slow. Unaware of how much history pressed down before they were born. Somewhere else, another woman listens to the city sounds. Footsteps passing. A cough. A cart rolling slowly. She knows this rhythm now. Not because she chose it. Because it stayed. Lamps dim further. Darkness doesn't rush in. It arrives politely. The city accepts it. This is not a story with a clean ending. There is no moment where everything is fixed. No speech. No resolution. Just continuation. Lives go on despite loss. That's not optimism. That's fact. People adapt because they have to. Some will remember what was taken. Some will remember only fragments. Some will not remember at all. Memory fades unevenly. And history fades faster. Those forgotten don't disappear completely. They leave traces. In habits passed down. In silences that feel inherited. In caution that seems older than the moment. They live on quietly. Without names. Without records. But not without impact. The city breathes in. Breathes out. It has done this before. Cities have a long memory, even when people don't. Walls remember footsteps. Streets remember weight. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it. The echo of lives moving through. Some stayed. Some were taken. Some never came back. All of them mattered. This chapter isn't here to reopen wounds. It's here to close the book gently. To acknowledge what history often rushes past. That victory didn't end when the fighting stopped. It spread out into daily life. Into households. Into childhoods. Into quiet endurance. And it stayed there. Long after banners were folded away. As the city sleeps, it doesn't celebrate. It rests. That's enough. Acknowledging those forgotten doesn't mean we speak for them. It means we notice the space they left. We don't fill it with guesses. We don't turn it into drama. We let it be what it is. Absence. Respectful silence. There's a strange comfort in ending this way. Not with answers, but with quiet. Because quiet is honest. It doesn't pretend things were simple. It doesn't turn suffering into spectacle. It lets the story breathe. Somewhere, a lamp goes out completely. The last one. Darkness settles fully now. Not threatening. Just present. The city sleeps. And in that sleep, life continues. Tomorrow will come. It always does. People will wake up and do what needs doing. That's not heroic. It's human. This is where we leave them. Not frozen in tragedy. Not lifted into legend. Just living. Remembering a little. Forgetting a little. Carrying on. And maybe that's the most accurate ending history can offer. A soft fade. No applause. No final line carved in stone. Just a city at rest. Holding stories it will never tell out loud. And that's okay. Because tonight, the point wasn't to solve the past. It was to sit with it. Calmly. Respectfully. And then let it sleep. So we do the same. We close our eyes. We let the lamps dim. We allow the silence to be silence. And we drift away, knowing that behind every quiet city in history, there were lives that continued. Even when no one was watching. Even when no one wrote them down. Good night.